All right, let's go into a review of what we did last time. So last time we talked about where Heidegger's take on Dasein is lacking in its explanatory power. And one of the problems with Dasein, as Heidegger um, explained it, was the lack of an appreciation for the role of the prime mover. So while Dasein does cut across the experience of individuals, communities, and material reality itself, it's on the level of the individual prime mover that Dasein actually is experienced as real. Now, the meaning of Dasein is a collective thing. So the individual is not experienced on his in his own right the meaningfulness of Dasein, but he does experience Dasein as a tangible reality, right? And then we also explained how for Heidegger every determinacy of being is metaphysical. Um, Let me read that again. To be honest, this one section of the text is the most difficult to understand. So even though I was understood it as I was reading it yesterday, trying to summarize it even a day afterwards is extraordinarily difficult. This is some of the most dense reading I've ever encountered. Experiencing finitude necessarily individually at the status of the finitude of being itself is not clear. Right. So we talked about how by Haas's take on Heidegger, um, part of the contradiction in Dasein and part of the reason Dasein continues to grow is that there's this aspect of it being, this encounter with the infinite, the finite's encounter with the infinite, right? So as we as finite beings and as finite collectives in a finite material reality encounter the infinity, encounter the infinite, the infinity of being, that then causes Dasein to continue to develop as we experience the Heideggerian anxiety and this sort of recasting of the objects of experience. Then we also talk about how for Heidegger, um, metaphysics is an actuality, and we relate that to his idea of a standing reserve, where by Heidegger's take, this sort of metaphysical outlook on reality becomes reality itself, particularly the Cartesian viewpoint, where this sort of Cartesian method of breaking everything down into its simpler parts and enumerating it in some way, measuring it in some way, that process of acquiring factual knowledge about things in reality becomes the overriding method of uh, of reality itself, where that becomes, the river becomes just the thing that powers the dam, right? The mountain becomes just a source of iron ore, right? Um, Workers become human resources. Although actually Heidegger believes that it's not possible to completely reduce mankind to a standing reserve. But I think he would say that this whole concept of corporate human resources is an attempt to reduce man to its excuse me, to a standing reserve. Okay. And then at the end of that section yesterday, he says, obviously, from an elementary Marxist or even common sense perspective, I'll just read you the whole paragraph. For him, metaphysics is an actuality, as I just explained. Thus, industrial capitalist modernity is itself the result of metaphysics, as I just explained, and it is implied a consequence of the history of philosophy. Now, he takes that out of the question of technology as well, because in the question concerning technology, it goes over basically the history of ontology and metaphysics, from the way the Greeks used to see it to the way it's seen now, right? Obviously, from an elementary Marxist or even common sense perspective, he gets the whole thing backwards. So I suppose what Haas is saying is that the material is the actual, and the metaphysical is not. But we're going to read on, and I'm sure Haas will explain further in the next section. Ah, come on. It does this every time, I swear. All right. To understand how being itself acquires a specific determination, it suffices to return to the ontological difference between being and particular beings. Heidegger situates this difference at the core of Dasein's existential turmoil, for which being is always at issue. And again, this goes into Heidegger's exploration of the concept of nothing and nothingness and the negation, and how that relates to this sort of existential anxiety that dissolves the objects of being back into being, so then that the objects of being can be recast into a new way of dealing with being, right? That's what he's talking about here. And I've explained that a few times in the last few episodes. Feel free to look past, well, not the negation actually, but if I try to explain negation and the nothingness and how they relate to anxiety, I'd probably get it wrong, because it's been too long since I've read that text. And that particular aspect of it is very subtle. So I don't want to lead y'all down the wrong. I don't want to give y'all an incorrect explanation of that. I do highly recommend that you read What is Metaphysics, where he goes into the subtleties of that. But what I explained in terms of this sort of sense of anxiety causing the objects of being to dematerialize in terms of the way we experience them, and then rematerialize in a new form. If you can understand that, that should give you a pretty good idea of what we're talking about here. This quandary, while not identical, at least parallels that of Kant, for whom the transcendental subject is likewise situated between the antinomies. So it suffices to, in parallel, look to Hegel for the solution and transpose the difference as a difference of being itself. Now, what he's talking about in terms of these antinomies is basically Kant saw the same thing that Hegel saw, where there are these fundamental contradictions in terms of the way man experiences being and experiences reality. But whereas for Hegel's explaining it on the level of the state, Kant is explaining it on the level of the individual conscious person. So again, it gets to this sort of idea of the finite versus the infinite, or of experience not not coming up flush with reason. And for Kant, and he's been criticized for this, so not everyone believes that this is valid, but for Kant, these are genuine contradictions. Um, certainly, certainly, in terms of the way they're experienced as contradictions that then have to get resolved, right? That much is just, you know, seems very true to me. Seems very clear. Seems very obvious. So even if there's no fundamental contradiction, they're at least experienced by the individual as a contradiction, which then plunges him into a sort of dialectical process. That is to say, the ontological difference should change the operative notion of being in the first place. From its one-sided conception mired in the stillness of thought to an understanding of being as itself contradiction, difference, etc., in sum, a dialectical union of contraries. Right. So he is saying that, okay, well, Heidegger is saying that this sort of process of having to recast being is a metaphysical process. And then what Haas is saying here is he's relating that to Marx and Hegel, well, specifically Marx, and saying that the difference is ontological. So it has to do with reality as it is experienced, not ideas about reality. So he's saying the contradiction is in the actual experience and not in our ideas about the actual experience. Right? So in other words, let me see if I can come up with a good example for that. So like if you're a Christian, for instance, and you notice that, bad things happen to good people, that's not a metaphysical contradiction. That's an ontological contradiction. Bad things really do happen to good people. And that's a contradiction that you as a Christian have to then deal with, right? And the way that you deal with that causes you to go through a dialectical process where you have to sort of confront God and wrestle with God, right? So I think that's a pretty good example of what he's talking about. Thus, being as such acquires determinacy as an absolute ontological union of opposites, transposing the difference at the core of Dasein to a feature of being itself. That there exists Dasein in the first place should change something about our understanding of being itself. Okay, that last sentence I'm going to have to chew on a little bit longer because, again, I skimmed this like I always do before I start these. But man, that second statement that's a tough one. But the first statement that he says, thus being as such acquires determinacy as an absolute ontological union of opposites, there he's just talking about what we were just talking about, where the contradiction is ontological and not metaphysical. I suppose what he's saying with that second one is the fact that there's a way that we experience material reality that is not material reality itself, that it's a constantly changing and evolving mode of experience that changes as we encounter the infinite, that in and of itself implies that there's some sort of contradiction, ontological contradiction. I think that's what he's saying. Yet, in contrast to Hegel, it is not necessary to draw the conclusion that thought comprises the essential element and the contradiction at the heart of being. This misstep of phenomenological Hegelians from Kojève to Zizek, who regressed from Heidegger's, the misstep of phenomenological Hegelians from Kojève to Zizek, who regressed from Heidegger's original achievement. Okay. I think he's trying to relate Dasein to Marx here. I think. No, he's not. No, he's not. He's still describing Heidegger here. So for Heidegger, thought itself is not what drives the evolution of being, right? Thought is after the fact, right? The experience of being itself is what is prior to thought, and that's what actually evolves. That's what actually is the motive thing. Just like, you have a child who, before they acquire the mother tongue, right? Before they're even aware of themselves as distinct beings, still their mode of experience is already evolving because it's phenomenological. It's not conscious, or it's not primarily conscious, right? The important conclusion is that ontology, taken not as a philosophical contemplation, but the real threshold by which mankind relates to being as such, is itself actively suspended and itself reproduced within material reality as the formative ground of all thought. So again, this is him saying that. So all right, so for Heidegger, really the evolution of Dasein really is crystallized in the development of language. So it's not the change itself does not take place within consciousness, therefore it does not take place within language. However, it's sort of crystallized linguistically. And what Haas is saying is that actually it's crystallized ontologically and materially, right? So our evolution of language doesn't really is not what provides the markers of the change of Dasein, if you will, but rather changes to the material reality itself. I think that's what he's saying. This threshold lies not in the limits of philosophy, but in the limits of man's existence itself. Right. So that is what he's saying. Itself suspended in temporal history. Such a limit lies not in the threshold of man's mastery over nature, but the limit by which man lives, relates to others, and to things. Right. So that's him further explaining what he said in the previous paragraph, and it's basically what I was saying, which is that it's the changes to the material reality itself, which is to say, uh, the threshold of man's mastery over nature. Let's see. Okay. So saying his the limit by which man lives, relates to others, and to things. Right. So that's the experience of reality itself that accounts for this sort of change in Dasein over time. Right. And this sort of uh, allusion to the limits of philosophy, I think, is also an allusion to Heidegger's orientation to language and the nature of language. Okay. Such a limit is not preempted by any philosophy, idea, or consciousness, but the genuine limit of man's existence in relation to the whole of being, conditioned not necessarily by physical limitation, but by the limit of the absolute contradiction which forms meaning itself. So here he's expanding it a little bit, right? Because now he's saying the limit of man's experience is that point at which he faces a contradiction, right? So the unresolved, the contradiction that man has yet to resolve, that is sort of the frontier of man's experience of being. So here he's kind of relating the materialist dialectic and kind of like that Hegelian idea to what he's talking about. See if I can come up with a good example. Um, oh, so like in capitalism as we're experiencing it now, capitalism is about the individual being able to own property. But we're experiencing a contradiction in this society where no one who's not an economic incumbent can own property because we're all priced out. So we as a society are facing a contradiction, and our experience of being is being limited by that contradiction, right? So until we resolve that material contradiction, we're just going to continue on the same trajectory that we're continuing on, where property becomes farther and farther out of reach for normal people, even as we live under a system that enshrines private property. I think that's a valid example. This can be understood as the contradiction between the givenness of being and being as such, or between the determinate norms of civilization and their unity in a state authority, a specific frame of past and future, particular and universal, many in one, etc. So here he's just presenting a number of categories that contradictions can manifest themselves in, right? So the givenness of being and being as such, that's an interesting one. Um, and then determinate norms of civilization, their unity in a state authority. Mhm. Heidegger, at least in his early years, could not see that the sign is not just a being for whom there's a question of being, but also a being for whom that question is already resolved in a specific way. Heidegger assumed that resolution was necessarily metaphysical. Again, that goes back to Heidegger's idea of language. So the way we resolved the contradictions within being was a linguistic process primarily. And what Haas is saying is that no, it's a physical process, and there are particular ways in which it can be resolved. While true for the history of philosophy, it is not true for living and real mankind, for whom the contradiction between the determinacy of being and an appreciation for the ontological is the very content of the latter. It is what gives being itself meaning. So what he's saying is that when we're talking about the history of philosophy, Heidegger's description of the evolution of language is how these sort of philosophical questions are grappled with. But for the lived experience of mankind, um, what we experience ontologically is what matters, and that's what gives our lives actual meanings, and sort of not these sorts of philosophical explanations of what's happening, but the thing itself, right? That seems kind of intuitively obvious. The absolute contradiction is a contradiction of incipience between determination and origins. The contingency of design is not simply a matter of choice, as Heidegger thought, but in a determination whose reason is only clear retroactively, like a wave function collapse. Okay. A wave function collapse, that's referring to quantum physics, where photons are waves until you actually look at them, until you actually observe them, and then they become particles, right? So you experience the waveform, but you don't see the cause of the waveform until you observe it, and then it collapses into a photon. Really what I think he's getting at here is that this development is nonlinear. I'll be honest though, that paragraph goes a little bit over my head. I'm not going to lie. The absolute contradiction is a contradiction of incipience between determination and origins. So, I mean, prima facie, it sounds like he's saying, listen, the contradiction is that we don't know where this change is coming from, and that we really only understand why it's happening after the fact. Right? So he's saying the contradiction is the fact that it's prior to our consciousness, that we can only understand it after it's already happened. I'm pretty sure that's what he's saying. But that's a very complex paragraph. A civilization is the way it is, not because it is physically impossible for it to be any other way, but precisely because it is physically possible. Only by assuming one determination against a background of many can a higher reason participate in the development of a people. And see, here's where he's actually getting back to Kant, because one of the what was the term? Yeah, one of Kant's antinomies is determinism versus free will. So it seems that the universe is deterministic, and yet we have free will. And that's a contradiction. Because everything's comprised of material reality, including ourselves, and material reality is deterministic. At least that was the idea at the time. That's sort of a atomist what's the word I'm looking for? Spinozan kind of a view. And yet at the same time, we have free will, and that's a contradiction, or at least we experience ourselves as if we had free will, right? And so this is kind of an allusion to that, because what he's saying is it's not that it's physically impossible for things to be any other way. It's that there's a certain number of things that are physically possible, and we're responsible for guiding ourselves and the people around us by navigating through the physical possibilities in the correct way. And we are going to pick it up from there next time.